Hi, my name's Jason Kennedy and I'm with the ear. This is the mighty Stratton Acoustics 1512, Elypsis 1512 to give it its full title. The Elypsis 1512 is broadly based on the JBL 4350, which was a pro monitor first produced in the mid-70s. However, the only thing it really shares with that design is the size of the main drive units. Two 15-inch bass drivers and a single 12-inch mid-range. Apart from that, it's an entirely new design. Inspired by is probably the best way to put it, rather than relating to. It's a much wider loudspeaker than most. I've done a separate interview with the designer Phil Ward about the technicalities of the design and the reasons for the choices made within it. But broadly, what you have is a approximately 280 litre cabinet weighing in at 140 kilos with large paper coned Pro Audio drive units for the mid and bass. All three drivers are very short throw types, unlike smaller drive units. Their large sort of surface area means that they don't have to move very much at all in order to produce serious volume levels. This gives them a certain advantage over smaller drivers where the amount of excursion, the amount of movement the driver has to do actually introduces quite a lot of distortion in itself. I mean, large cones do have other issues, they have breakup issues, but at domestic volume levels that's much less likely to be the case than it is in sort of professional applications. The Stratton has a large 29mm tweeter in its own isolated enclosure. This is a rubber sort of isolation gasket and it has its own baffle. The mid-range sits within its own enclosure within the box, so it's sealed. The bass system is ported by 4 ports at the front there. There are no ports on the back, which of course means you can place the speaker relatively close to the wall if you need to. There are output controls for the mid and treble. These give you up to 1.5 dB difference in output relative to the bass, so you can increase or decrease the mid and treble to suit both the room, the tastes, and the placement. A speaker of this size is never going to be as easy to place or to move around as a smaller one, so having these controls means you can adjust the balance to suit practical positioning in the room. The front baffle is made of 10mm thick DuPont acrylic, whereas the rest of the wooden part of the box is in Baltic birch ply with, in this case, a olive veneer, book-matched olive veneer, which is particularly attractive. The metal parts are all anodized to an extremely high quality. It looks like high-grade paintwork because it's so smooth, but in fact it is anodizing. Apparently the company that did this also does Bentley and Rolls-Royce cars. The stands are unusual. They are cut in what is called a Veroni pattern, which it imitates nature essentially. It's a bit like a dragonfly wing. No two holes are the same shape or size, and this has the effect of isolating the speaker from the floor and of giving the impression that the speaker, visually at least, is floating. There's very little, it's a very sort of see-through transparent system, which is quite at odds with the sort of traditional style of the loudspeaker overall, but does work. It works extremely well, in fact. Given the size of both the box and the drive units, you might not be surprised to hear that this is a pretty efficient loudspeaker. It doesn't require a lot of power to drive. When Stratton bought it over, they actually lent me a push-pull amplifier, a push-pull valve amplifier, which was a prototype from Rogers, and that drove them extremely well and with considerable ease. I ultimately went back to my regular more amps power amp because that was a bit quieter, and I sit relatively close to speakers and the system, so sort of hum and buzz from electronics is more obvious, especially if you're not playing at high levels. And perhaps one of the most surprising things about this loudspeaker is that you can play it at low levels and get fantastic results. It's probably the best speaker I've ever had in that respect. It works so nicely at levels which don't stop you having a conversation, that while it's nice to turn it up, you know, and feel the energy of any performance, you get almost as much enjoyment out of them when you're playing at a sensible level, which from a neighbour's point of view and from one's own hearing, of course, is quite beneficial. Despite their appearance, these are not bass monsters. The people that have come here to listen to them have said they don't sound anything like they expected, which basically means they expected them to sound very sort of powerful and sort of heavy in the bass and to sort of shake the whole room. This room is reasonably bass light, but you can get extremely deep bass out of the Stratton, yet it's always controlled, it's always clean and fast, and you can hear tremendous amounts of detail across the band because the bass is so clean. There's no muddying of the mid-band by box vibration or driver. There doesn't appear to be any overhang in the bass. The bass stops and starts as fast as any 6.5 inch two-way does, which is quite extraordinary really, given the size of the drivers. And everyone that's heard them has sort of noticed this, has thought, how can a speaker this large with drivers this big be so precise? And yet, clearly with modern drivers and modern engineering, it seems to be possible to do this. The fact that there are so few loudspeakers in the domestic world of this sort of scale means that we very rarely hear anything of this nature, and that's perhaps gives Stratton a certain advantage. The high sensitivity really helps, and the low distortion, the low coloration really helps as well to make this an outstanding loudspeaker. I really like the way you get so much space and time in every piece of music you play. Everything is really easy to hear into, and it feels like you've got longer to enjoy it, which I think is a factor of the lack of coloration, the fact that the drivers don't carry on vibrating after the note finishes. The box doesn't carry on vibrating, and the whole thing remains super clean and coherent. It's also an extremely fast and immediate loudspeaker. Again, this goes against what you'd expect from large drivers, but it's definitely the case. You get the sort of immediacy that you'd expect of a smaller loudspeaker, but along with this you get the depth of bass and the resolution that you'd expect of a very expensive high-end loudspeaker, which it is. It's a very expensive high-end loudspeaker. The price, £82,800 in standard form, and this isn't standard form, of course. This is one of the more luxurious finishes in the range. That's another aspect about the Stratton approach, which is that they designed this on the one hand to stand out because of its wide baffle, but also to be incorporated into people's homes more like a piece of furniture than a piece of audio equipment. I mean, I don't know about you, but I recall in the 70s quite a lot of people had fairly large loudspeakers which they put on the floor because they didn't intrude on their living spaces. The fashion these days is to have stand-mounted or floor-standing speakers that are narrow and tall, and while that works acoustically and doesn't take too much floor area up, it is fairly intrusive if you want to place your speakers correctly. The argument that Stratton gives is that you can either design your room around the loudspeaker, or you can have it as a statement within the room. Naturally, you'd have to have a fairly large room for it to sort of sit happily and to look appropriate or in scale. But I think if you can afford this loudspeaker, you've probably got a large room already. When Stratton asked me how long I'd like to keep this loudspeaker for, I thought, well, I can't move it myself, so I better not have it for too long. I said 2 weeks, that should be enough. Usually it is. However, once I'd had them for a week, I realised that that was not going to be enough, and that despite the inconvenience of not being able to try other loudspeakers in their place, I wanted to hang on to them for a bit longer. And tomorrow 3 weeks comes up, so they're going away, which will be a sad day. I have to take my hat off to Dave Fowler and Phil Ward, whose project this was. It's extremely successful. It reveals that the way modern high-end loudspeakers are designed, essentially as towers for the most part, is not the only way to go about getting great sound in the home, and proves that wide baffles and big drivers certainly have a place in the most ambitious system you can imagine. I would quite happily live with this loudspeaker if I had a bit more room and some wheels underneath them. See my full review in the link below. Thanks.